makes sense. So I don't think we're going to lock in. I think this treaty is going to set a broad architectural framework that makes room for those kinds of investments and incentives in each country.
Next call is from Prairie Grove, Arkansas. Good morning to Richard on our independent line. Hi.
Well, good morning to you, and thank you for taking my call. Climate change. The Earth has been changing since its existence. That's what it does. And for man to think that he can do anything about the climate is nothing more than trying to stop the tectonic plates from moving. Man had better start spending his money learning how he's going to live with it, not change it. However, look into precession, a 26,000-year wobble of the Earth. It is responsible for some climate changes. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I think you put your finger on something very important here. We aren't going to solve it simply by cutting emissions. We are going to have to adapt. Those emissions that are up there in the atmosphere last for 100 years. So we're going to see the sea level rise. What I described in the North Carolina Outer Banks is going to happen. What we're doing today is trying to cut the emissions so that it isn't worse. We're going to see those impacts. We're going to see higher temperatures. We're going to see sea level rise, and we have to adapt. And it's something that up until very recently the U.S. has been behind. Countries like Bill's talking about in the Caribbean, they're on top of this. They're planting mangrove swamp. They're moving the hotels back from the beach. They're doing things to deal with the greater hurricane risk. We are only just beginning to do that, and we need to. It's a big piece of this problem, and you're on the money exactly, caller.
Address the U.S. debate on emissions for a moment. There's been a lot of discussion about a carbon tax. An article here from last week in the Washington Times. A carbon tax is touted as simpler in this debate over energy. What's your organization's view on a carbon tax?
Our view, Bill, is that you need to send a price signal, and you can do that with cap and trade because requiring companies to buy permits sends a price signal. We need citizens to see the higher prices in their electricity, in their gasoline, and so on. We've seen the effect, in terms of in the last 2 years when gasoline went from $2 to $4. In the last 3 years, we've had a decline in the number of miles driven, vehicle miles traveled by citizens across America. The experts said it could never happen. We'd always drive more. In the last 3 years, we've actually driven less because the price was high. So we believe in cap and trade, but I think carbon tax can do the job as well. Both methods send a price signal. That's what we need. I think the political thinking here is that if I do a carbon tax, it's hard for congressmen to vote for high taxes. So we'll get less than we need to protect the environment. So I think the better way is to go with a cap and trade. And I think there are ways to I can describe it in more detail if you're interested, to deal with the price impacts. We do want to avoid big price volatility.
Price volatility for the consumer.
Exactly.
Next we go to Pittsburgh, and this is Pat, Democratic caller. Good morning.
Good morning. I used to work for Westinghouse Nuclear Energy in the 70s, and we had a group come over from France. They were called Framatome, and we worked with them very closely, and that's where they got their energy, and you could see what's happening over there. They have mostly all nuclear energy. The problem is I keep in contact with these people. We became very friendly and visit each other every once in a while, and they tell me, and I've read this before, that there's no good way to store the results of their energy. That they store the waste in glass particles of some sort, and it's eating through the glass particles in the ground. I think nuclear energy, it would be wonderful if we could store it safely, but there are facts that say it cannot be stored safely. In fact, I think I don't know what their problem is for another company in Pittsburgh who's building vessels to store it in, and they've been building them and they're sitting out in lots, in storage in parking lots, waiting to move these, and it's been about 10 years, and they cannot get them out there because I think there's problems with theirs too, and that worries me to death.
Well, it's a very good question, caller. My sense is that there's a better answer. It's not quite as bleak as you portray it. Today, we store nuclear waste on site at the 100 nuclear plants we have in the U.S. We store it in big swimming pools. We store it in what's called, I think what you were describing, dry cask storage, where the waste is put inside these steel tubes. The problem when you describe the people having trouble getting it from the site, basically we've had difficulty with regulations about moving it off the site. My personal view is it's fine to keep it on the site. I think there's good evidence that we can store this in big concrete bunkers. We can store it in the dry cask storage. They've tested. They've taken these dry cask things and thrown them off bridges, highway bridges, not with the waste inside, and fine, they don't break. They can actually withstand that. So I think there is a solution. I'm with the administration. I don't think we rush and store it in Yucca Mountain out in Nevada tomorrow. I think let's make sure we've got it right before we put it underground, because it's going to be there for thousands of years. But for the time being, I think we can store it safely, and I think nuclear will be a part of the answer. Some of my colleagues in the environmental community are nervous about that, but I think we have to recognize it's zero emissions or very low emissions compared to coal, and it's got to be a part of the solution. It's not the whole solution. There's no silver bullet here, but it's a part of the solution.
As Congress comes back, the House in particular is going to take up energy legislation. An article here by Juliet Eilprint in the Washington Post last week, the headline of which says, House climate bill aims to please environmental and business interests. And just a piece of this, she writes the measure would also provide incentives for industries that will be hit hardest by a limit on emissions, including a $10 billion fund to promote carbon capture and storage technology, and a provision that would reward carbon-intensive manufacturers that face global competition. Can a bill like that please both environmental and business interests?
I think it can. I think this is a very important bill. This is a Waxman-Markey bill, and they'll be doing the hearings this week on this bill. I think it has a lot of promise. I mean, this idea, basically we've got to take care of the callers you heard from the coal states and from Ohio and so on. They've got a legitimate concern here. Coal is a big part of our economy today. It's a big part of the jobs in those states. Steel and cement and so on are a big part of the jobs. We do need to find a way to use coal cleanly, and I think this carbon capture and storage, where you basically take the CO2 gas out of the waste stream going out of the plant and you put it underground in deep aquifers, makes a lot of sense. The U.S. has a lot of places we can do that. We've done it in the oil industry for many years, so it's a known technology. It's never been used by power plants. So I think it's very promising. I think there is a way to blend, and I'm very impressed with this bill. I think it not only is it good from a domestic point of view, but it's the first bill that really addresses the international context of we need to deal with encouraging China and these other countries, as I talked to you about in the beginning, to take more action. I think this bill is a real breakthrough.
Ned Helme with us for about another 5 minutes on the Copenhagen Climate Treaty, the negotiations on that. Connecticut, New Hampshire is next. Good morning to Warren on our independent line.
Good morning,
hey there.
Mr. Helme. I have always considered clean coal a myth. From what I've heard, the best estimate is it's 10% cleaner. I'd like you to speak on that. And also, do you know, as a planet or as a country, how many millions or trillions of pounds of this are we releasing into the air all the time that wasn't here before, like the last caller 2 or 3 back didn't seem to understand? I wondered if you could just speak on those 2 points.
Okay. Thank you for your call. And on the question about clean coal, as I mentioned, this carbon capture and storage would basically, today when you burn coal in a power plant, all that CO2 goes up in the atmosphere and sits up there and causes a greenhouse effect, as we know. With capture and storage, I basically take out 90–95% of that gas, trap it, and store it. So it's not clean in the sense that I've cleaned it up and washed it. It's clean in the sense that it's no longer being released to the atmosphere. It's being stored underground. And this is a transition strategy. This isn't the answer for the long term. In the long term, we've got to go to efficiency. We've got to go to renewables. We've got to go to nuclear, to other new technologies. But in the short run, this is a good answer. In terms of your question about the size of emissions, the U.S. emits 7 billion tons a year of CO2, and we're about a quarter of the world's emissions. So the world emissions is in the 25 to 28 billion tons a year. So it's a lot of material being released, and you're exactly right. When you think about that, sitting in the atmosphere for at least 100 years, we're building up a huge block to the sun that's causing this greenhouse effect. There's no way that isn't a major problem. So we do need to reduce those emissions, and doing it via capturing the carbon out of the coal in the short run makes a lot of sense.
Ned Helme is the founder and president of the Center for Clean Air Policy. It says that you helped write some of the amendments for the 1990 amendments to the Clean Air Act in 1990. So with the EPA on Friday making a major policy statement on carbon dioxide, what do you think Capitol Hill will do?
Well, I think this move by the EPA to regulate CO2 as a pollutant, which they needed to do but based on the court case, Massachusetts versus EPA, is a very good step. It was a necessary step, and it puts real pressure on the Congress. So the Congress has a choice of do nothing and let EPA regulate through the Clean Air Act, and I think, as the Washington Post editorialized last week, it's not the best way to go. The Clean Air Act isn't perfectly suited to doing this in a really cost-effective way. We could do it. It's appropriate. We need to do it. But it basically puts the pressure on Congress and says, all right, Congress, step up. You can do it much better. Pass a law that gets this job done. And I think that's the way we need to move.
Las Vegas is next. Good morning to Catherine, a Democratic caller.
Yes, I just want to say that I've sat in nuclear hearings 19 years, and I've listened to the devastation of nuclear power. And we have the waste isolation plant here in New Mexico, and there's pressurized brine down there, salt water, and they just hired this PhD that's a car specialist to review the Department of Energy's own data. And the test wells are showing that the water is rising, and this nuclear waste that's sitting down in Carlsbad is in salt water, and they're metal drums. You know, this is really a crime to humanity.
Thank you, Catherine. We'll get a response.
Thank you, Catherine. Good question. And I think my answer to the earlier caller about nuclear goes right to the heart of your question. I agree with you. We shouldn't be putting it underground today until we know we can handle those brines and those problems. My suggestion is we store it temporarily in these big concrete bunkers in the swimming pools we have on the nuclear plant sites today in this dry cask storage, and we do the research, we learn from the mistakes that are being made in New Mexico so that we can have a permanent solution. But it's not that much material. It can be compacted down. It can be handled on site until we've solved the problems you're underlining. And I'm with you. We need to fix those problems.
To California next. Sacramento, good morning. This is Vicki on a Republican line.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Helme. I would like to, my concern is that all of this with climate change, there is such a emphasis on the fees, fines, and mandates that people are going to be charged for all of these things. And I would like to know I'm in with agriculture. I'm involved with agriculture, and every year, agriculture produces things that are carbon sequestering. Mm-hmm. What credits is agriculture going to receive from this policy? I know the oak woodlands produce. They provide sequestering. Also orchards and all crops that are grown every year. And I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Thank you for your question. A very good question. This legislation I mentioned, the Waxman-Markey bill, would provide credits to farmers who reduce emissions via no-till agriculture, maybe if you've got a cattle farm, capturing the waste and generating methane, electricity from the methane, reducing the fertilizers, the N2O-bearing fertilizers. So there's a big opportunity in this new legislation for farmers and for the agriculture sector in general, dairy farms and so on, to generate credits that they can then sell to the big power plant in California that has to meet its standards, meet the new standards of the Act. The credits will be generated by what you do on your farm. You'll be able to sell those to the power plant and make it cheaper for all of us to meet the national goal. So there's a big opportunity here.
You obviously know what a lot of other countries are doing in terms of their atmosphere, their environment. What other country would say it was a model in terms of things like carbon capture, things of keeping the air clean? I
think in terms of developing countries,
yeah.
The best examples are China, which is surprising, and South Africa and Mexico. Those three big countries are doing the most. As I mentioned, China has a number of very tough programs. South Africa has developed a strategy for the country over the next 50 years that will cut emissions dramatically.
How are they doing this?
They're basically cleaning up their coal plants, heavy emphasis on efficiency and renewables, big opportunity for solar and wind and that sort of thing. Better standards for buildings. A lot of the townships in South Africa, have very rudimentary housing. They burn open stoves for cooking. They're basically putting in very efficient kerosene stoves in these poor communities. And it's amazing how much energy you save and how much carbon emissions you avoid. So there's sort of a sustainable development piece to this for developing countries where they can do things that actually help their development and also help the climate. And that's what we're seeing from some of these leaders.
Next call here is Bill in San Antonio, Texas. Good morning on our Independence line.
Yes, first I'd like to thank Mr. Helme for what he's doing, and I appreciate it. I've been involved in environmental matters since probably Margaret Thatcher brought out the global warming as an issue, and I knew it was known about before that. But my problem is that since I spread the word here in San Antonio, I'm having a hard time because being on the front line, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of support for if it happens or if it isn't. And as Mr. Helme said, scientific community pretty much is 99% has said it's a real thing and a real danger. But my question is,